But good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the Education Specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I'd like to thank you for joining us today with our guest author, Laurence Desotell. He's going to be speaking about his newest work, The Captured, the Sick, and the Dead, Confederate Soldiers at Camp Randall. But before we get started, I just want to take care of a few housekeeping notes. I'd like to say thank you to, first of all, our foundation for sponsoring these free virtual programs that we get to do. The Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, and in particular, their executive director, Ms. Jennifer Carlson. They do a fantastic job of supporting us, and without them, we would not be able to put on all the free virtual programs that we do month in and month out here at the museum. Also, I would like to say a very special thank you to our sponsor, Generac Power System. Without Generac Power Systems and the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, none of this would be possible, and we would be doing something else for lunch today. So thank you to those two great organizations for their continued support in the programming that we do here at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Also, I would like to remind everybody that we do have our security features enabled today. So nobody will be allowed to start their video, and nobody will be allowed to unmute themselves. But if you do have any questions for our author today, please feel free to submit those to me via the chat function here on Zoom. I'll be putting those into the PowerPoint presentation and bringing them up at the end so that not only our author can see the questions, but also all of our audience members can see them as well. Like I said, today's guest author is Laurence Desotell. He is the author of The Captured, the Sick, and the Dead, Confederate Soldiers at Camp Randall. Larry is he's also the author of the Confederate Rest story, or I'm sorry, the Confederate Rest of the Story, published in spring of 2021 issue of the Wisconsin Historical Magazine. And he's also appeared on Wisconsin Public Radio's morning show, the Civil War Talk radio program. He's made presentations at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha and the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable, and also the Waukesha Civil War Roundtable. He taught American history and political science at Arrowhead High School in Heartland. And after he taught that after graduating from the University of Wisconsin. And Larry is currently retired and living in Sturgeon Bay and enjoying the wonderful weather up there, as we were talking about earlier, in Sturgeon Bay today as well. Larry, thank you to our program.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm very impressed that there's so many people who are interested in this. That's great. Great to see.
Now, our book talks have generated quite a lot of support and quite a lot of interest since we've started them a couple years ago. And so we're very happy to see such a large audience today, and especially for your book. And you know what? Everybody's here to listen to you and not me. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you, sir. The floor is yours, and we'll see you at the end for questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, you can see the title of the book. It comes from a trip I made to the museum, many years ago, or excuse me, to the cemetery many years ago, and saw those. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And then I kind of forgot about it. And then with what was going on with the monuments across the country and so on, I decided to dig into it deeper. And as I say, it's like going down the rabbit hole. So the more I learned, the more I realized what I didn't know. So I just kept going, and finally it became big enough to become a book, which came out in 2020. So very fortunate to have somebody do that. Now, a little background: the soldiers that ended up, the Confederate soldiers that ended up in Madison, came from after a battle of Island Number 10, which, if you've got good eyes, you can see over here. If you can see my where I'm flashing this back and forth, which was part of this the Mississippi Valley campaign that started when the Confederates occupied Columbus, Columbus, Kentucky, which basically allowed the Union forces to invade Kentucky, end Kentucky's neutrality, and then were able to capture Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, which then kind of, in a sense, flanked Columbus and forced them to leave. And they came down to New Madrid here on the Mississippi River, in this what's called the New Madrid Bend, this double loop of the Mississippi River. A little bit closer look is right there. Here's New Madrid. Then the Confederate forces arrived there, took over at New Madrid in July of 1861. And when John Pope's forces got there, particularly after he brought us some siege guns, they were able to force the Confederates out of New Madrid, and they went to island number 10, which is right here. It's a little dark, but there it is right there. So named because it is the 10th island from where the Ohio River enters the Mississippi. In April, because it's really April 8th when it finally was surrendered to the Unions, it was flooded. It was probably 3-4 feet deep, all over the island. It was horrible conditions for the Confederate soldiers that lived there and were working there and fighting there. The Confederate forces first got there in October, and then they began their retreat on March 15th. In fact, one of the units, who many members were captured, the 1st Alabama, they got there on March 13th. And by that time, it was already decided by the Confederate command, particularly Pierre Beauregard, that island number 10 was not worth it anymore, that they needed to get soldiers down to Corinth so that they could spring a surprise attack on Union forces that were moving in that direction. And that became the Battle of Shiloh, which was fought the day before, 2 days before, as well, the taking over of island number 10. So the Battle of Island number 10 tends to get lost. It's not very well known in many ways, just like the presence of Confederate soldiers in Madison. Not too many people know there were prisoners there, that there is a graveyard there. You probably do all know because you're interested. Most folks would not have any concept of that. So that the island itself was taken by the 15th Wisconsin, the Scandinavian Brigade, under the leadership of Colonel Hans Haig. He was later killed at Chickamauga, and I see that, unless, I don't know if it already happened, but I think it's coming up, is that where his statue is being rededicated after the head was lopped off during some unfortunate activity there, but kind of showing how people don't know the history. If you wanted to attack somebody, it wasn't Hans Haig, who was an abolitionist and gave his life to end the institution of slavery. So that's where they came from. They came from island number 10, the soldiers. Who were they? The 3 main regiments that had troops who came to Madison were from the 1st Alabama, the very first unit registered or mustered into the Confederate Army. The 1st Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi Regiment, which is also known by its shorter name, the 1st Consolidated, but it's also sometimes called the 4th Confederate Regiment. And as the name implies, it's made up of soldiers from Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And then there was the 55th Tennessee, which was formed in Western Tennessee, and actually had the highest number of prisoners. There were 1,224 prisoners who were brought in total. 10 of them were non-combatants, and they were involved in shipping some of the more seriously ill soldiers up the Mississippi. But there were also smatterings. The 40th Tennessee might have had 40 people. The 4th Arkansas, just a few. The 12th Louisiana had 4. They had 7 soldiers captured and brought to Madison, of which 4 died at Camp Randall for a pretty high rate. Bibb's company of the Tennessee Artillery, on the other hand, had about 36 soldiers brought to Madison, and none of them died. So kind of the condition before they got there, I think, had a lot to do with that death rate. And then there was the 1st Tennessee Heavy Artillery, and so on. The 1st Alabama had served, as you can see there on the top left, in Florida, at Pensacola, it was started out as an infantry regiment, who was then trained to be an artillery regiment, and had earned a decent reputation. And so they were brought up to Island number 10, and in a sense kind of became the, they were sacrificed. They remained in place to allow the rest of the Confederate force to move south down towards Corinth. They accepted that, as you can read by a guy named E.Y. McMorris, who's written a regimental history. But they were, 7 members of Company B alone, the parole guards, died and are buried in Madison. And although this, excuse me, I need to go back. The Mississippi, the flag of the Mississippi Devils, that is Company I of the 1st Consolidated, they had 8 people die and are buried at the Confederate rest there in Madison. So that's kind of who they are. When I started to do this, I wanted to find out whether or not, or how much there was of a connection to slavery. And what I did was I used a system created by the name of Joseph Glathar, who applied it to the Army of Northern Virginia. And what he did was to put soldiers into really one of 4 categories: those who own slaves themselves, those whose families own slaves, those who worked for someone who owned slaves, and then of course those who were not slave owners and had no connection, really, in a sense whatsoever. Now most of the soldiers that came from the Alabama portions of, obviously, the 1st Alabama and the 1st Consolidated came from what is called, and still is called, the Black Belt, that gold strip in the middle of the state of Alabama that you see there. The stars represent counties in which over half of the population was made up of slaves. And you can see that's quite a few. Not every county there contributed, but you can see Pike County and Barber County there, Barber County way in the east, Macon County there as well in the east, Montgomery County, all those again with stars had over 50% of its population was enslaved. I came to know many, at least the background of many of the soldiers who came from Choctaw County in Alabama, there in the far west, and particularly a place called DeSotoville. Now, I remember I once had someone ask me if I made that name up because it's somewhat similar to my last name, and I said, no, I did not. I did not create the name DeSotoville. They did that themselves many, many years ago. But the 1st Consolidated, again, was another company. But again, we're just really concentrating on those soldiers who came from Alabama to find out what, again, was their connection to slavery. The 1st Consolidated, 2% of the members that I could find information on. I found 129 names from the 1st Consolidated who were in the 1860 census. And the 1860 census is a very helpful one for people doing research on the Civil War, because it lists what their real estate value was and what their personal estate value was. And my theory was that if someone had a high personal estate, they might be slave owners, and then you could look them up in the 1860 slave schedule. So what I found was, of the 129 that I found, 2% owned slaves, 5% their families did, and 3% they worked usually for somebody who owned slaves. Everybody else, whether I found them or not, I assumed, and that's based on the 494, that number that I found names for, that they did not, I just assumed they did not own slaves. because if they did, they would have probably most likely been listed in the census, because the number of slaves they had at the time helped determine the state's population and therefore their representation in the House of Representatives in 1860. Using other sources, I kind of found that the so-called cost of an average slave was about $800. That is, some slaves, a good, fit, young 20-year-old male slave was worth a lot more, but older slaves were worth a lot less. And that's a pretty grim way to put it, but it is just a fact of our history. So if you were, basically you had, put it into today's dollar, at least in 2020 dollars, almost $28,000 per slave on average again. So you could include from the first consolidated, not all that connected to slavery, but in the first Alabama, there are 30% are connected to slavery in some way. 7% again owned slaves, 17% their parents probably did, and 6% worked for somebody who owned slaves, but they did not own slaves themselves. It's also important to remember that for certain people of certain incomes, it was possible to rent slaves. And I went through a lot of research on that. And these were people who were owners of small plots of land, not enough to be able to necessarily afford large number of slaves or even a few, but they could rent them for a while, perhaps at planting and harvest time, for somewhere between $4,800 and $5,600. And again, it just depended on how much of a crop they had, because some people couldn't do it at all. They didn't own slaves, they didn't own cotton. Like all things, there was the idea that the big producers could afford the cost of slavery and could, in a sense, force smaller producers out. Of the 140 soldiers who are buried at Confederate rest in Madison, and if you haven't been there, it's basically right where Madison West High School is. And of those 140, 18% were found to have a connection to slavery. 2 owned slaves, 17 came from families that did, and 6 worked for someone. Now, those are not percentages, those are actual numbers out of the 140, which is 18%, which is about an average between 10 and 20. So, it kind of shows that all these numbers are kind of fitting together a little bit and giving you that. Now, 30% is pretty high. I did this because I wanted to see whether or not, with numbers, with facts, whether or not the idea that, that so many people didn't have any connection to slavery and would not have been fighting because of that. I heard that many times. I went to one of the ceremonies at the cemetery in 2017, I believe it was, when I first went there. And one of the speakers made this mention that that none of them had any connection to slavery. Well, that just whetted my appetite. And so I looked it up, and this is what I found. So, I'm not arguing that everybody fought because of slavery, but I am saying that there's convincing evidence that it played a role in many people's decision to join the Confederate Army. The idea that, secession was caused by slavery, that's almost a different argument. But I think if you look at the even just the ordinances of secession of the southern states, which are described in the book, you'd see that that's the cause. I mean, Abraham Lincoln captured it, in his second inaugural address. All knew that somehow slavery was the cause of the war, but he called it, interestingly, American slavery. you can call it Southern slavery, because there are so many connections between slavery and business interests and consumer products that benefited people in the North. So it was truly American slavery. It's just that the slaves were concentrated in the southern part of the nation. So you can take this as you will. You can deduce for yourself whether you think these statistics are meaningful or not. But these are the statistics, at least as I found them. Once captured, they were sent to Madison and were to be guarded by the 19th Wisconsin. Now, the 19th Wisconsin is somewhat unique in that it was the only regiment in the state that was formed under the authority of the War Department rather than under the authority of the governors. That was an experiment. It didn't last very long. The governors didn't like it because the governors, by appointing commanders of these regiments, many of the field and staff officers, that was a source of patronage for them. Things were expected in return. If it's all under the War Department, then that patronage would not affect the governors of the state. So it wasn't just Wisconsin that didn't like it. There were many. It was formed in Racine by Colonel Horace Sanders, a lawyer who lived there, was a war Democrat, not a Republican. And there were also many members of the 19th who came from places like Michigan and Minnesota and other states. They went to Camp Randall, which was, of course, named for Governor Alexander Randall, who was a major recruiter of troops. And obviously, before he left office, he left office. He did not run again in 1961. Excuse me, he did not run again in 1962. For his third term. In fact, I think he ended up being named the American ambassador to the Papal States, I believe is correct. And Camp Randall was named for him by a guy, one story says, by the colonel of the 2nd Wisconsin, a guy by the name of S. Park Coon of Milwaukee. But there's also evidence that the state legislature named it for him as well. Whatever story is true, it was the old grounds of what really was the state fair, the fair of the Agricultural Society of the state. And it eventually trained over 70,000 soldiers from Wisconsin out of about 92,000. The rest of them being trained in Racine, such as the 19th Wisconsin, or in Fond du Lac, or in Milwaukee. Those were the big ones. So the first group got here. If you notice that date, the 160th anniversary of that first arrival of the main portion of the prisoners. Came on April 20th. So it's just 2 days from now. And they had been taken to Cairo. They had been taken to Springfield, Illinois, which is where Camp Butler was, which also had a lot of members of soldiers, Confederate soldiers who were captured at Island Number 10. And then they came up to Janesville, and from Janesville, they came to Madison. On that day, that is April 20th, 3 of them died and were buried immediately at what has been called Confederate Rest, really an old pasture. In fact, when the first Confederate prisoners were buried there, it said that there were still cows chomping on grass and pigs rooting through the area to feed. There was a second group. This was a group that was judged to be very, very, very sick. and too sick, it was thought, to be able to withstand the rail traffic and transport to Madison. So they were brought up the Mississippi by steamer. There were at least 184 of these, and 10 of those died on the way up. 3 more died on the way to Madison from Prairie du Chien. Although, again, there's always some question as to what their names were. That's one thing I found, that it's very difficult to come up with exact names. But one I know for sure was James Harris Barber from Choctaw County in Alabama. He was a member of the 1st Consolidated. And the reason I bring his name up is it shows how things work. I noticed in online that there was a set of papers that a woman named Goldie Posey had that was supposedly described what was going on at Camp Randall. So I thought Goldie Posey, who lived in Oklahoma, I decided to see if I could find that she had a land phone. She did. I called her. I introduced myself. She doesn't know me from Adam, but we talked for a while, and she was gracious enough to send up the all that she had. And I tried to insist that to let me pay for the copies and for the postage. She said, no, all you got to do is give me a copy of your book. When that was over and I tried to do that, she said, no, yeah, I'm paying you for the book because I want to buy some more. So she was very kind. One thing it's taught me is that a lot of times people are really willing to help. You just need to ask. And that's kind of the way things are. But with the information she had, so I've kind of developed a fondness for the memory of James Harris Barber, excuse me. And I put flowers at his grave, though I won't be able to do so this April 20th, because I will no longer be here for that. But I'll get back to that later in the year. But I'm one who thinks there's nothing wrong with putting flowers at the grave of these soldiers. That's my view. I don't at all justify their cause, but the whole idea that you forget the humanness, the humanity of people is what allowed for slavery, and we should not continue to use that. We need to forgive ourselves for the whole sin of slavery in the United States. Again, that's my opinion. There's a recruiting poster for the 19th, who was, again, the basic reason they became the Guards is they were the one formed regiment, is still in the state of Wisconsin at that time. So they came up to Madison. They had no training as prison guards. In fact, they had very little training at all, even as in how to use their weapons. And they're interesting. They ended up serving in Virginia as provost guards, and probably became really one of the first Wisconsin regiments to have Black soldiers become part of their group. But they were, I'm trying to write a book on them too, but that's in the future. There's a picture. If you go to Camp Randall for a football game, and you walk in kind of where the statue of Barry Alvarez is, if you know where I'm talking about, and then you turn to the right, on the wall, there is this picture. And these are troops that were captured and brought to Madison. Unfortunately, there's no information as to who they were or even what regiment they might happen to be from, but they were there. Now, the place where they were kept, that is where their barracks were, so to speak, is kind of, again, you'd have to know Camp Randall, but if you know where the shell is, that's basically where they were. And actually, the barracks they were in were not fit for prisoners, because all there was between the barracks and the road was a little row of hedges, which they could kind of get through if they wanted to. And it's known that at least 6 escaped, of which 2 were recovered. And we'll see a little bit more about that in a bit. But Camp Randall was not really set up as a prison camp, although if you read more, you realize most prison camps weren't really set up to do that. And here's a picture. Here's where the prison yard was. And again, basically just a row of hedges. The guards did duty, the members of the 19th on, they basically walked a beat, so to speak, and did that 24 hours a day to keep prisoners inside the facility. Now, some interesting side notes. It's believed that, I believe that one of the prisoners, Private C.F. Desotell, brought a slave with him when he left his home in Choctaw County. And there is evidence of that. There's a source for that I found that I think proves that he took with him a family servant, which again was called a mess boy or cook or body servant. Now they use the word servant. That was pretty typical. They didn't like to use the word slave because, well, for a variety of reasons. And I think the name of that person is John Wesley. He was identified as one of the prisoners brought up via Prairie du Chien on the Mississippi River there. And when I looked up C.F. Desotell, I found that both he and his mother owned slaves. He was living with his mother in 1860. He had slaves, and that he had a male slave who was about 16, which is relatively the same age, and he brought him with him. I'm convinced that that's what he did. Another incident occurred when Amos Carr from Waupun, who took a bribe to allow 2 Confederate prisoners to escape, and was just getting ready to do it on a mass scale, like 200, when he was on duty. But that one failed because by that time they had caught up with him. But one of the prisoners was identified in the paper as somebody named Lang, spelled L-A-I-N-G. Now they were recaptured the next day, and in the list of prisoners that was compiled by James Heberlein, and I don't know if James Heberlein is listening, but he is. If he is, I want to thank him greatly because he created the path which I followed. That his research in finding the names of the people who were prisoners at Camp Randall really made my job just so much easier. So there was a guy named C. Lang on the list, which is spelled L-A-N-G. So I looked for him in the census. See, you got to be a crazy person like me. I would spend hours looking at census numbers. You got to really go down the rabbit hole to enjoy that. But I looked in Wisconsin in 1860, couldn't find a Clark Lang. Looked in Tennessee because he was in a Tennessee regiment. No, couldn't find him. Looked for him in Alabama in 1860. No, he wasn't there. Looked for them. Then finally I decided, well, maybe I should go back a decade. And I looked at 1850 and I found a Clark Lang, a farmer, 19 years old, who was living in Waterloo with his father. They were farmers. Now, to recheck that, the National Park Service says there is a Clark Lang who served in the 4th Confederate Infantry, which I said earlier was another name for the 1st Consolidated. So I thought I had my man, and I was pleased as punch when I made that connection. That was a thrill to be able to kind of put that puzzle together, which is kind of what researching history really is. But he was he survived the war. He was again captured, and he was brought back. He was brought back to camp. Interestingly, he and his compatriot had stopped at a farmhouse on the way. They were trying to get to Waterloo, and they had supper with some woman who lived there, and didn't pay for it. And so on the way back, the captors, Charles Whipple, made them pony up 10 cents a piece to pay the woman for their dinner. So I guess that was a pretty good deal, 10 cents for a nice dinner, particularly probably compared to what they were eating at the camp itself, at Camp Randall. Now, there were also women there. One of them was Bridget Higgins, who is from Galway, Ireland. Her husband, whose gravestone you see there, J.S. Higgins, was a member of the 1st Alabama. And this is not unusual. Many women came with their husbands to the scene of the war, their war, wherever they might happen to be stationed. There was also a Rebecca Parrish. Now, she met a lot of tragedy because on island number 10, before their capture, her husband and 2 children died. And she came with she decided to stay with her brother. Whose name I never found, because Parrish is her married name. There's no way I could tell who her brother was. But, you know, that's the kind of suffering. I mean, here's a woman who comes to island number 10, is captured, brought to Madison, Wisconsin, and had to suffer through the death of 2 children and a husband. Suffering doesn't really much care which side you're on anything. But it's interesting. And there were others as well who survived, but those are just 2, Bridget Higgins and Rebecca Parrish. I wonder if I can. There we go. Again, there were 1,224 prisoners, 140 died, and that death rate, if you go just by the death rate on the given number of days that they were there, their death rate was over 2% higher than, or twice as high, excuse me, not 2%, but rather twice as high as soldiers sent to Camp Douglas and who stayed there. Most of them were recorded by Dr. Joseph Hobbins as dying from typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other things. And the interesting part again is that the book, the ledger that he kept his records in, is in the vaults of the Wisconsin Historical Society, and you can go there and ask for it. And, you know, I was able to read it and see it and put it in my hands. And that was, again, a great part of the research that happened to do that. He was a local doctor. He was not an Army doctor, but he was from Madison, and he came to tend those Confederate prisoners who were dying in droves. And George Paddock of Baraboo, Company A, wrote letters back home, and in one of them you can see what he says, that the poor rebels have a hard time here. They die off like rotten sheep. There were 11 die off yesterday, and so today, and there ain't a day but what there is from 2 to 9 dies. I tell you, it looks hard. And he was on the burial detail that was there. Now, word of this high death rate began to kind of leak out. Joseph Potter, who was associated with Camp Douglas, he was like a commissary sergeant, officer rather, came to Madison to inspect conditions, and what he saw kind of flabbergasted. I mean, he said, you know, there's hundreds of patients that are laying on the ground. We sent them bedding, and sheets and linen and things, but it was all kind of taken by members of the 19th. So that piqued the interest of this guy, William Hoffman, the Commissary General of the Union prison system, the top dog in the prison system. He came to view it for himself, and he basically wrote back to the War Department that there were no, as he put it, no signs of convalescence. That is, nobody was getting better. And what he decided to do was to remove the doctors of the 19th from the care of the prisoners, along with Hobbins, and just let Hobbins do that, and have the doctors of the 19th just tend to the members of their regiment. One of whom, Charles Cook from Calumet, died while he was at Camp Randall. I believe, if I remember, from typhoid fever. So he tried to do that. He put a regular Army officer in charge of the hospital, who is really the recruiting officer in the area. And of course, the death rate didn't improve whatsoever. In fact, you could make an argument that it actually got worse. So things got bad enough that eventually, after only 6 weeks in existence, after the death of 140, or actually of 113 soldiers, prisoners, Hoffman made the decision to close the prison camp. Didn't close Camp Randall, of course, but closed the prison portion of it, and sent the surviving prisoners to Camp Douglas, which is where he wanted them all along. He believed that was where they ought to be. They never should have been sent to Wisconsin in the first place. Camp Douglas was suitable, but he was overruled by higher ups who weren't even involved in the prison system. And all but 130 of the 1,200, and well, there's, again, of the 113 or so that died, there still were 130 that were believed to be sick enough, or their attendants who remained in Madison. And many of those were to die yet. They just hadn't gotten to that point. In fact, eventually there were so many deaths that the Army decided to hire a private company to bury the bodies, and for $5.50 a body, they would be buried in a pine box, and they would have a wooden marker that would indicate their name and their date of death and their regiment. But because they were written on pieces of wood, they didn't last that long. But I guess that's pork barrel politics of the Civil War era. Now, this little chart, there's a lot of information here, but these are basically the death rate. You can see there were 497 members of the first consolidated, and 62 of those died, for a daily death rate of about as you can see, about 1%, a little bit more than that. And then the 55th Tennessee did a little better, and the 1st Alabama did a little bit worse. They were hit a little bit harder. Now notice the different numbers account. You can say you got to take into account the numbers of soldiers there were when trying to figure out the meaningfulness of any of these statistics. I mean, if you notice again, 38 members of the Bibbs Company, none of them died. Of the 1st Tennessee Heavy Artillery, only 1 died. But then the 12th Louisiana had 7 people there, and 4 of them died. So why would that be? And my research suggested that it was because of the influence of those sent via Prairie du Chien. That if you looked at what they did, they had a higher death rate than did the ones sent directly to Madison. And they also ended up, if you took them out and compared the ones sent to Madison to the ones who were sent to Camp Douglas, Wisconsin had a lower death rate. I think it's basically the concept that there were a lot of the sick people. There's evidence of it from newspaper accounts that the sick of Island number 10 were put on board that ship and were sent to Madison, because that would be the easiest way to get them there. So that's what that's why these stats are like that. You know, people wanted to blame a lot, but again, why these variations in death rates of people who were there? Because they didn't get treated any differently. It's a lot to do with how sick were they. In fact, I found also that for companies E and G of the 1st Alabama, they had a higher death rate in the field from illness, from sickness, than they did at Camp Randall. And I guess maybe the reason I went into such detail on that is because somehow my Badger pride wanted me to say, oh, we wouldn't treat people worse, at least not on purpose, hopefully. And I think my research shows that was the case. It really had a lot to do with the condition of the soldiers when they got to Madison, rather than how they were treated at Madison. Now, one of the interesting tragedies of the story was the shooting death of George Washington Spears. Again, another DeSotoville, Choctaw County guy. You can see down below, that's Hobbins writing and recording his death, a corporal. Now, he was shot by Clarence Wicks, whose picture I have on the right. His picture was sent to me by a woman by the name of Phoebe Monton, who, again, I called up. I saw something online about her. I called up and she sent me all this stuff. I mean, to have a picture of him, that's really nice. Spears was one of the guys who would have been recorded as having worked for somebody who owned slaves. He was the overseer on 5,000 acres of land and 36 slaves owned by Cullen Roberts, who was one of the wealthiest people in Alabama in 1860. Now, there was a dispute. George Washington Spears had a brother who was also at Camp Randall, who had been captured. And he was ill, it seems, and he came out one day to relieve himself, to put it in a way I would say number 2. Now, there's evidence that a lot of the soldiers would do that in front of the guards to kind of intimidate them. But whether that was the case here, it's impossible to say. But Wicks, who was on guard duty where Spears, Henry decided to do his business, told him to stop and move to a regular sink, a latrine. And Henry William Spears ignored him. So what happened was that then Clarence Wicks threw a stone, one Confederate referred to it as a brick, and hit Henry William Spears in the face with it. And about this time, Spears, George Washington Spears, a bunch of other guys came out of their barracks and referred to George Washington Spears referred to Wicks as a bull run son of a bitch, which was like an insult at that time. Spears responded, Wicks responded by shooting him dead. And there was an inquiry same day, which found Wicks innocent of any charges, and it said he was justified in his shooting, they put George Washington Spears to rest. Now, they had a third brother, Alexander Spears. Alexander died at Camp Randall. He was not a slave owner, but he died of disease 4 days before George Washington Spears was killed. So think of this. Here are 3 young men from the Deep South, from Choctaw County, who fate brings them to Madison, Wisconsin. 2 of them die there. Another survives. Henry survived Wisconsin, but when he was sent to Camp Douglas, he died and is buried there. What a rough go for the mother. I mean, the poor mother. Did she ever come north to see where her sons were buried. Doubtful, but that's the price of war, the cost, measured in terms that tug at the heart. And it's a sad, sad part of what was going on. In Wicks's case, when his 3-year enlistment with the 19th was done, he joined the 36th. And the 36th saw a lot of rough action. One of those was at a place called Totopotomoy Creek, which is really part of the Overland Campaign, the Cold Harbor portion of it. Sometimes it's referred to as Turner's Farm. He was shot there. He was wounded there. He was captured, and he was brought to Belle Isle Prison in Richmond. And he died there in late 1864. So to me, this symmetry, there's got to be some Greek or Roman who wrote about a guy who shot and killed a prisoner who then died as a prisoner in that army's hands. There's got to be the tragedy of the 3 sons all dying in the war. We kind of maybe put it like Saving Private Ryan, but the classics did it as well. And this is a sad, sad case. This is now. I'm finishing here. Yes, I hope that's good, with just a short 3-minute review of some of those who died, and I hope you enjoy it. Oh, I guess I thought it was in a different place. Excuse me. One of the things, all I wanted to say was that one of the things is that there's 140 tombstones, but there's no list that has 140 names on it. And names are different. On tombstone number 19, it says George Laurent. There is no record of George Laurent. It's probably George Carr, but it's the wrong name. And there's another guy whose his tombstone says Thomas Conmoner, but there's about 7 or 8 different ways of spelling his name. So who knows who these guys really are, what their names really were. And unfortunately, that's again one of the tragedies, that they died, but somebody had asked for a certain name and they'd give them the wrong name and say, oh, that can't be my son. It was taken care of by Alice Waterman, who was a Southern belle, and then came to Wisconsin and began to take care of the cemetery, planted bushes and trees and replaced the wooden markers from time to time. And she too is buried there, she says, with her boys. She's buried with the 140 members that are in Confederate rest. Wisconsin actually became one of the very first places to honor the Confederate soldiers. That started way back in 1872, 150 years ago. And it was done by the work of that then Governor Cadwallader Washburn, who was a general, as you can see, a cavalry in the 13th and the 16th Corps. And notice he says, I care not speak of their action, engaged in a cause which no attribute of the Almighty could approve. They have dearly paid for the penalty of their error. Oops, excuse me. So we should, as a token, we should reconcile. And to do that, there's no harm in putting a flower on their graves. And notice what he says, and maybe it's a little bit blocked, but it says, when God placed his hand on my enemy, I took mine off. And I think that was an important thing. These 2 markers are the 2 that were removed. The first one was put up, and the one on the top was put in 1906. In 1930, they laid a wreath there and asked, but were denied permission to fly a Confederate flag there, way back in 1930. because of opposition from veterans organization. And that one was removed in October of 2018. The other was the Confederate rest marker placed by a private citizen, William Huggins. There's some mistakes in it. He says that all of them were from the 1st Alabama, and the part that rankled, I think the city council in Madison, was that it said unsung heroes. It was also at the time of when Dylan Roof went into the church in the Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and shot many of the people who were attending services there. And that one was removed even a whole year earlier. But both of those are gone. Interestingly, there's a soldier named William Green of the 1st Alabama whose tombstone is behind the old United Daughters of the Confederacy monument. And when they removed it, it was in the best shape of any marker because the sun could not ever get at it. And much controversy over whether or not this was the right thing to do. And I read somebody, a nice woman sent me a little website about a lawyer in Madison who's suing the city for their removal. Now this is.
You still with us, Larry? I think we may have lost our speaker. Larry, you still there?
You want me to stop?
Oh no, we lost you for a minute there. As soon as you slipped onto that last slide, we didn't hear anything at all. So I think we did lose you for a second there.
Did you hear the song eventually?
No, I didn't. I don't know if our audience members did. I did not hear any song at all.
Well, let me try one more time to see if it works. If it doesn't, just put your hand. If you can't hear, just put your hand up.
Sure.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry, we're not getting any audio through on that one.
Okay. I don't know how that works, but
Well, the joys of modern technology.
But I guess it's not set up for that or something. I don't know how that, but too bad. It was just kind of a list that showing some of the tombstones and some of the background information on who's buried there for about 15 of them. But it goes with that song, The Empty Chair. But unfortunately we can't hear the music. So I guess I think I probably used up more than my allotted time. So it's probably good that, once I get going, but if there's questions, love to answer.
Well, and it was an excellent presentation. I love the Governor Cadwalader quote that you had at the end. When God put his hand on my enemy, I took my hand off. I thought that was amazing.
Right. I agree that I think that's a good lesson for us.
Yeah, I would agree as well. We do have many questions from the audience. I'll go ahead and get into those right now. We're also getting a lot of positive comments. Everybody liked your presentation. They thought it was fantastic. And like we spoke earlier, this is a topic that we don't get to hear about too often. So it is nice to have this perspective for sure. Let me get back to the first question, Larry. What was the biggest takeaway from your research that you got when conducting your research on this topic?
Well, I guess the thing is that it proved to, I guess because I always thought so anyway, but it proved to me the centrality of slavery in causing the war and why many of the soldiers fought, because, there's a term that's always used as the Southern way of life. And even though you might not have owned slaves, there was always a place below you in Southern society by having slaves there. So that's kind of a sociological impact, but I think that's an important part. The other thing, and I think maybe even more central to the human condition, is the suffering of, the people dying of disease. And, I was reading about guys sitting in, basically standing in the cold waters of the Mississippi for, hours on end doing performing their duty. And a lot of them, like the 1st Alabama, was ordered to send all their heavy clothes home. And now they get to Madrid Bend in March. Well, I mean, look at today.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I know we're further north than that, but you know, there's a lot of times where it's miserable in March. You'd want to have warmer clothes, that's for sure. But that's a big part, the suffering.
Move on to the next question. Can you please remind us of the formula that you used to differentiate between those who had connections with slave owners and those who didn't?
Correct. Again, it was from a formula created by Joseph Glathar that he applied to the Army of Northern Virginia, because he wanted to see what the spread was there. And as it turns out, he made 3 categories, actually 4. One of them, okay, which soldiers actually owned slaves themselves, which ones had basically parents who did, and therefore might inherit those slaves at some point in their life. And then those who worked, you know, like clerks who worked for people. There's one guy I remember who was a clerk for a merchant in Mississippi, that Mississippi regiment, who the guy owned, the merchant did own something like 38 slaves. So that's the 3rd category. And then everybody else was assumed not to own slaves or have any connection to slavery, more accurately. So that's the way I used his, and that's what I came up with. I think what the results show is that it sets the floor. It's the lowest possible connection. And I believe that it's actually higher because, again, I think a lot of people rented slaves too. But that was impossible to tell.
Yeah, and the amount of work you did, just as far as your statistics go, Larry, that's just amazing. Historians love to read about statistics, but we hate researching this.
Yeah, and this is from
you did a fantastic job.
I'm definitely not a math guy, so that was one of the hardest parts of it. Definitely one of the hardest parts of it.
But I think most historians go into that field of work because we're not math people at all.
All right.
The next question, did the black soldiers that served with the 19th, did they come from Wisconsin, or were they contraband that joined up while they were in the South?
None of them came from Wisconsin. Some were contraband that came from Norfolk. There are others who joined from North Carolina, but some were actually free men as well. And that comes from Benjamin Butler's contraband policy that eventually the War Department said, if you want to sign up black soldiers, it's okay at first, as long as you don't let them like have weapons. But eventually, obviously, they could. But there's one of them who ended up coming back to Reedsburg, a guy by the name of Henry Robinson, who was born in Virginia, came back after the war, came to Wisconsin after the war, and died many years later.
Larry, why were the prisoners sent to Camp Randall in the first place? Was it because that they were captured by Wisconsin units, and that's where they were decided to send them, was up to Wisconsin? Obviously, you know, Camp Randall isn't the nearest POW camp to Island 10. So one of our audience members was wondering why they were set up to Camp Randall.
It's basically because it's what Henry Halleck said, where Henry Halleck, who was the head of the West at that point, before he became the head of the whole Union Army, he was in command of the Department of the West, and he said they should be sent there. That's why they were sent. It wasn't because the prisoners from were captured by Wisconsin soldiers, or because that was the closest one, because it wasn't the closest one. Camp
so it was just a random decision, huh?
Was a lot closer, or Cairo, or lots of places in Illinois were closer. He just decided they ought to go to Wisconsin, and I've never really been able to figure out why he thought that. But and this was actually a step forward, because prior to this, a lot of times, as soon as prisoners were captured, they were paroled immediately. But they weren't, they had to give up their weapons, but they were sent back to the army that they were a part of. But things began to change in '62, and like I say, Hoffman did not want. First of all, he wanted to be in control of who went where, just bureaucratically, right? And secondly, he just thought Camp Douglas was a much better facility because Camp Randall wasn't really ready for prisoners. So I think that's part of the deal.
The women that you mentioned that were brought to Camp Randall along with their Southern prisoners, were these camp followers, or were they brought brought with them from the South for other reasons?
Well, most of the women, like the two that I mentioned, came with their husbands. To me, the word camp or the term camp followers has more of like a negative connotation. Like they were following the camp for a particular reason, which is illegal. But that's not true of the two women that I talked about. And some of the other women worked on the boat that transported them up. Some of them were cooks. They were cleaning women, but they were considered to be Confederate sympathizers, and their husbands were there too. And so they were just all brought up and sent to Camp Randall.
Okay.
They weren't, to put another word to it, they weren't prostitutes.
Sure. Yeah, I know. And whenever I hear the term camp followers, I always think of the cooks and the laundresses and the seamstresses. There's also the other connotation as well. You're absolutely right about that. What did you learn about the Barber's short life story as you were doing your research?
Well, James Harris Barber, the father was born in Georgia and had bought land in far western Alabama there in Choctaw County. I think he bought the land in the 1840s. By 1860, he had a good amount of land under his control and probably owned upwards of 20 slaves. So he was like, as I call it, like the Southern view of what Lincoln called the right to rise. He had basically started out with nothing, and because of the fact that he had land, and then he was able, as it grew, to buy more slaves and buy more land and produce more. One of his sons was named Eben. He became a lawyer. James Harris was a teacher before the war. But Eben never went off to war. Just James did. And then unfortunately James died. Eben tried to find him in Madison, but strangely he had met somebody in Chicago that said, don't bother going to Madison because you can't tell who anybody is. As it turns out, that guy was wrong. So he never got there to see where his brother was buried, which, would have been a form of closure, as we would say today.
I'm not sure if that was the last question or not. We'll take a look. That was the last question.
Okay.
But I did, before we go, Larry, I just want to point out one more thing as well. We've been working on this here at the museum as well, and it was pointed out by one of our audience members also. The Hans Hague rededication ceremony for that statue will be on May 29th. That's a Sunday at 1 p.m. That's going to be at the top of the Capitol Square. So if you can kind of envision where the museum is, it's going to be at the exact opposite side of that. So we hope to see as many people come out for that rededication ceremony as can make it. And Larry, if you're in town, we sure would like to see you then. I know you said you got a couple research trips coming up here, so we definitely would like to meet when you do come into town. But thank you again so much for this fantastic presentation today. I've got note after note after note from our audience members just raving about how wonderful the work is that you've done, the comparisons, the statistics, and just the overall story as well. It was just an excellent work all the way around by yourself and your research. So we'd like to thank you for joining us today and for presenting all that. We would also like to thank all of our audience members for being with us today as well. We do enjoy having everybody come out and be with us for our book talks and our other events that we do, such as trivia night, our movie discussion night, our drink and draw events, and our curator conversations events, along with all the other virtual programming that we do here at the museum. So thank you to everybody who has joined us today and has joined us in the past and is willing to join us in the future. You can find all of our events on our website, wisvetsmuseum.com. Right under the events section, You go straight to our programming calendar for 2022, and look forward to some 2023 programming notes coming up within the next few weeks as well. Larry, thanks again for joining us today. Fantastic work, fantastic presentation, and we hope to maybe have you back again someday with your second book.
Again, thank you very much. It was great. And remind people that there are books available if they want to read the whole book.
Absolutely. And Larry, I'll let you remind everyone where you can get a copy of that.
Okay, I will. Just let me give me a second here.
No problem.
You can either mail me at Laurence Desotell author at gmail.com, and if you send me your address and $32, I will send you the book. I will give you my address, and then you can I will send the book to you as soon as I get your order, or you can go through the publisher, which is sandbeachpress.com. And that's the other option that you would have, and they would that you can just do right online, and you have to pay a little bit more only because you have to pay the tax, but it's probably an easier way to go because it's just you and her going back and forth. But I would be honored if you would buy it. There's a lot more in there that I could get in the 50 minutes or so I had. I think, and hopefully you might enjoy it.
And also, if you need that contact information repeated, you could certainly email me here at the museum and I can pass that along to you.